Hey everybody, it's Tom, and I just wanted to come to you with a brief remark, reflection upon the tragedies in Paris and Beirut and elsewhere over the course of the past week or so. Hopefully it goes without saying that these events constitute an execrable tragedy. It's disgusting, it's horrible. There's nothing positive to be asserted in connection with these happenings. There are various phenomena, various facets of these happenings that deserve and have received some attention, such as the fact that, the treatment of what has occurred in Paris has sort of overshadowed comparable happenings in other parts of the world, in Yemen, in Beirut, in Iraq, Turkey, so on. And that unevenness of treatment itself reflects certain other realities in terms of what's happening with class relations, with ethnic interactions, how those axes whereupon class differentiation become established are connected to broader geopolitical motifs. Or you could also look at how the reality, extremists as they're called, people fired by certain rather unfortunate perspectives, are driven to positively senseless violence, how these occurrences are in many ways a reflection of Western and American intervention in the region of the Middle East. These are all themes that have received ample treatment elsewhere, and I'm sure many of you are already encountered a great deal of that. So I wanted to approach the matter from a somewhat different direction in the hope, perhaps the quixotic hope, of enriching the conversation. And that is vis-a-vis a remark, or well, it's more than a remark, but a brief sort of framing of the media that I encountered through Thomas Merton. Did another video on Thomas Merton way back, but unfortunately I don't have the text where this remark is found originally. That text is Faith and Violence. I just don't have it on hand. This is from a collection of sayings of Merton entitled Seeds, right? And it was edited by Robert Inchausti. I'm not certain how he says his last name. But in any event, this is the passage in question, which I think can be a useful point of departure for reorienting ourselves with regard to the goings-on in the world at large. Merton proceeds to say, 9/10 of the news as printed in the papers is pseudo-news, manufactured events. Some days 10/10, the ritual morning trance in which one scans columns of newsprint creates a peculiar form of generalized pseudo-attention to a pseudo-reality. This experience is taken seriously. It is one's daily immersion in reality, one's orientation to the rest of the world, one's way of reassuring himself that he has not fallen behind, that he is still there, that he still counts. My own experience has been that the renunciation of this self-hypnosis, of this participation in the unquiet universal trance, is no sacrifice of reality at all. To fall behind in this sense is to get out of the big cloud of dust that everybody is kicking up, to breathe and to see a little more clearly. It is Thomas Merton from his book Faith and Violence, also excerpted in this collection entitled Seeds. Events versus pseudo-events. So one has to be cautious here, because clearly it would be absurd to proffer that the grotesque violence which we have witnessed over the past week or so in the world represents a pseudo-reality. These are real people who have died or have been injured in catastrophic ways. Their lives will ever after be they're damaged, and this trauma obviously is going to redound and ramify for all of us. What is pseudo is not the fact of the violence and the suffering which it entails and the deaths which followed in its wake. What is pseudo about these events are the rather convenient narratives or stories or frameworks which are being put forth to apprehend what they mean. And already in a way I've alluded to that in my sort of preambling remarks. Okay, the most obvious pseudo event in connection with these tragedies is the war on terror, right? Which is sort of a way of justifying what is really a rather inchoate, inconsistent exercise of military force without having to address a coherent political antithesis, right? Terrorism isn't even an ideology, it's a tactic, which is why the notion of the terrorist as the boogeyman is even more is successful than perhaps its historical precedent, wherein it was the communist. The inconvenience of the communist is that the communist actually has a coherent ideology, and they're actually the terrorists, by not having such a coherent ideology, just being a perpetrator of irrational violence, is someone with whom we needn't even bother to enter into a conversation. And so by putting things all together in this little rubric, we avoid engaging the concrete realities of the human world and human relationships in which we are actually living. And it's not just a question of terrorism, there's also the question of the almost ludicrous misunderstanding. Right, it's not almost ludicrous, it's ludicrous, it's inane, it's disgusting. The mischaracterization of Islam and of the Muslims of the world, which have fallen, which has followed in the wake of these occurrences. But they're just that mischaracterization is just a cousin to the childish figment of terrorism. And all this, is part of an enormous pseudo-event, right, which is sustained by most of the media. And in the wake of the event, you have the French now have bombed, more or less arbitrarily, a city in Syria, Raqqa, about 200,000 people. The vast majority of whom are civilians. Now they're without electricity. Museums have been hit. Apparently, some clinics have been hit. Who are these targets that they are, which they are, directing their force? Do these people even have anything to do with what happened in Paris? Right. The gorilla in the corner is that no one really knows. So you have a handful of 8 or so perpetrators, at least 7 of whom are confirmed European nationals. One might have been from Syria, but that's still very unclear, And that's all ridiculous in of itself, but the absurdity is then compounded by the fact that it is being invoked to justify a regressive approach to the refugee crisis in Syria, or well, it's in Syria, but the refugee crisis for Europe, where people who are being forced to flee their homes because of a devastating civil war that grew out of American and Western intervention now have no place to go but to spaces like Europe. And yet the Europeans and the Americans were the ones who have forced them there, and now we don't want to pay the piper. So we have now a situation where instead of looking at how the consequences of our institutional and our real violence are giving rise to hideous things like the attacks in Paris on Friday, rather than look at that, we sort of reframe the significance of the event to justify the very xenophobia which was employed to fire the aggressions in the first place. And if that's not all bad enough, the xenophobia isn't even really why we're over there. And you know, why the Americans are there, why the French are there, why NATO is there. It's not to do with democracy. It's not even, in a sense, it's not even about oil. It's about power and about a consolidated infrastructure that, by the way, leaves a vast majority of the world's population in a state where happiness is rather hard to come by. And I'm not just talking about the billions of, the billion or so people who live on less than $1 a day. I'm even talking about people in the heart of empire, the American middle class, for example, whose lives are often characterized by a psychic freneticism that is simply antithetical with human fulfillment, and that in virtue of that they're enthralled to the imperatives of capitalism. That's suffering, and that's not, by the way, to say that the suffering of the average American middle class is near tantamount to, someone who's starving to death in India. There's a very significant difference in scale there, but it's still suffering. And at the background of all this is the question of what does it mean to have a civilization? If civilization is a project which is committed to a society that grants fulfillment to its members, which I think that's what civilization should be, and I think it's what civilization can be, well, by that standard, we are not living in a civilization, or we're living in an incredibly inadequate effort at a civilization. And we can do better, all right? But part of doing better is taking the time to grasp what is real. And to grasp what is real, we have to begin to detach ourselves from the false and fictitious lenses and stories, etc., that we're being sold. It's the proverbial bill of goods. We've got to put that away. And unfortunately, and then I'm just going to add that the process of that disentanglement is not simply one of being more attentive to the facts of the matter, though that's certainly a portion of the task. There is additionally a question of how we are going to be as individuals. How are we going to, as individuals, on an immediate scale, lead our lives in a way that is no longer amenable to cooperation with the frameworks that presently saddle us. And one part of that is changing our relationship with time and no longer being beholden to the rhythms of the machine. We take that seriously, and we also take the idea of love seriously, then things are going to start looking rather differently. So to sort of draw it all to a point, since I just wanted to offer a brief reflection, I just want to exhort all of us to be careful not to be hypnotized by the convenient, oh, this is very ironic in the background, playing on the radio. Here they're playing the American national anthem, a battle hymn. That's quite amusing, quite an ironic juxtaposition. In any event, and football, there's events and pseudo-events. Anyway, the unwitting benefit of filming in a public place. I don't know if you can even hear that in the background there. But anyway, to draw it to a point, we should be careful not to fall into a convenient account of why the things in the world are happening in the way that they are. And have the courage to live out what is implied in moving out of the cave into the real world. All right, well, that's all for now. This has been Tom, and I hope you're doing all well. And hopefully I'll see you later. Bye.